your view on this isn't a victimless crime, prostitution. These women don't want to be there. They're not choosing to be there. They haven't chosen this lifestyle. It's really the devil attacking their identity in Christ. And he's going to use us to set them free. Our next speaker is a guest and new friend of mine. He's very dear to me, Corporal Alan Wilkett. I met him through events and people in Pasco County in Florida. He's been fighting on the front lines to close these places down and rescue these victims. And he's a believer. And he was praying for someone to be on the inside to be able to help rescue girls. And he just says, man, what you guys are doing is an answer to my prayers. And we work together in agreement of prayer. Our team texts him when we're out, share our location just for safety and wisdom. But he's a wonderful man of God. I'm just going to read a quick bio to you about him so you can understand just more of how awesome he is. He served with Pasco County Sheriff's Office since 2005. His total law enforcement experience is over 23 years. He's been patrol, court security, investigations, crime prevention, and community relations are all assignments that he's fulfilled in the years of service. In 2007, he was awarded Law Enforcement Deputy of the Year, holds a Florida practitioner designation in both crime prevention and CPD. Say that really fast. CPDD. Crime prevention through environmental design. He was awarded the award by General Pam Bondi in 2017 for Florida Human Trafficking Law Enforcement Official of the Year. Okay, I'm just going to read it instead of trying to do it because you're too amazing to mess it up. So Corporal Wilkett has devoted the past several years in the fight against human trafficking. He has trained and instructed law enforcement, federal agents, state and local agencies, NGOs, along with multiple groups, churches, and organizations. The Pasco Human Trafficking Task Force, the Human Trafficking Commission, and Light Up the Night are current initiatives. Excuse me. Corporal Wilkett has recently awarded the 2017 Florida Human Trafficking Law Enforcement Official of the Year from Attorney General Pam Bondi. So I met him, we met, and he said, man, I've been praying for someone to be on the inside. When they go in these places and they do bust, he doesn't arrest these girls. He knows they're victims. He wants to give them resources and he wants to help them. And one of my favorite stories of his is when he came in and he arrested one of the men for doing an illegal activity in one of the clubs, buying sex. He cuffed him, shackled him, and walked him around the stage a few times and let the men know, I don't put up with this in my county. But he didn't arrest the girl. No, he gave her resources for help. And so that's what I like about him. So please welcome Corporal Alan Wilkett, but we're going to watch a quick video first just to educate you on what Acts of Love does and what we're doing out there. And then he'll talk more about the awareness, and then we'll go into more about what we're going to do to fight it.
First of all, I want to say it's an honor to be here. Thank you for the invitation to come and be a part of what you're doing today. And what you're doing is so critically important. And I'm going to say it from a law enforcement perspective, and it's probably non-traditional. There's been a lot of culture change that's had to happen in the mindset of law enforcement over the past few years as we've taken another look at prostitution, sex trafficking, clubs, XXX video stores, pleasure spas. I mean, you name whatever that venue is, we've had to kind of change the mindset. So I first of all want to thank Monica for her vision and this mission of Acts of Love, which I think is really cool. The last time that I was part of one of her events, I actually got to take one of the t-shirts with me, a Hope Dealer. I thought that was really cool. And I thought that was a great t-shirt. So I've got that somewhere. I don't know where it's at right now, but I've got that because I'm moving today. So this morning I had to be at another event, and then I'm going to be at this event and shoot back up to Pasco County and get the move done and hopefully get it done by this evening. So it's a busy day, but I don't know where the shirt is right now, somewhere in the moving and the packing, but I love that shirt, Hope Dealer, and that was awesome. So, and I will also tell you that what inspires me the most about this ministry is the heart and the passion that drives it. It's not driven because somebody saw that maybe there would be some state or federal money that's going to come and make somebody rich and get an organization off the ground. This has really been done because somebody had a heart and a drive to really reach out to broken people. And as you know, and I'm not telling you something that you do not know, but having dealt with this for many years now, I can tell you that this particular area of criminal activity that we see going on with sex trafficking produces some of the most broken people that I have ever seen in all of my years of working in law enforcement. When Monica was reading part of that bio, and by the way, chopping it up pretty good, and messed my. I thought I looked good until you got done reading that, and I said, nah. And no, I'm just kidding. I'm just teasing. That was fantastic. The bio, and they'll read that sometimes when I'm asked to come and speak, and so they read this bio, and it gets longer and longer, and it's a pretty long bio, and they tell me, send your short one. I said, that was the short one. If I sent you, because and I tell them, I said, it's not because I'm talented, because I'm not talented at all. It's just that I've been around for a long time. And when you've been around a long time, you get these bullet points that get added to your bio, and it gets longer and longer. But I have had the opportunity to do some really cool things in law enforcement. Law enforcement's been a good career for me, and it's been good to me. I've had a chance to do just about everything you can do in law enforcement. And I say it kind of funny sometimes. I've done just about everything you can do in law enforcement except have a dog. I've never been a canine officer. And then I always preface that by saying, but I do have a dog. He just happens to be worthless. And he's a 110-pound Doberman pinscher. He's worthless. I'm telling you, he is worthless. Won't bark at anybody. I told him the other day, I said, you are an embarrassment to the Doberman breed. And but he's so I've not had a chance to be a canine officer, but I've had a chance to do narcotics and undercover stuff, and which is fun. That's a real adrenaline rush, making the buys and all that kind of stuff, and wearing the wire. All that's kind of cool. Done some undercover work. Done some work with the Attorney General's office with the narcotics task force, and cold case and homicide, major crimes, and just those kind of things. So I've had a chance to do some of those things, but I have never seen a more evil or more vile or more ugly crime than that of sex trafficking, ever. And that's in all the dirty stuff that I've seen. I have never seen anything more dirty than this particular crime. I say that only to say this to you. That's why you have today the thanks and the admiration of this old street cop, because you are frontline, going behind the front lines. I'm still kind of pushing things ahead of me. You slip in behind the lines and you minister to those who are desperately broken. And I cannot tell you that, again, just from both a law enforcement side, but just from this believer, that I cannot see a more pure form of godliness and religion than those who are willing to go to those lengths to reach the broken people. There was a pastor of a very small church over in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, Bishop T.D. Jakes. Just kidding. He's got this really big. You can kind of go, no, that's, you should have known right away I was teasing with that. He's got this humongous church. But he made a statement one time that I have always found to be kind of a core statement that I look at. And he said, and it was a very interesting statement. And he said, you can always tell when somebody has truly been delivered when they're willing to go back to the pit from which they were dug and rescue someone else. And I always have remembered that statement as a very impactful statement, to realize that there are people who are willing to go to some of the deepest places, darkest places, and bring light. And that's exactly what you do. Today I'm only going to take 6 hours or so. And I told that to Monica, and those that overheard me were like, okay, can we leave now? No, just the next few minutes, just to share some things from both a statistical standpoint for awareness purposes, so that you kind of know the hole that you're working in, the dark place. but also some personal experiences that I've had that, again, from my view, kind of highlight the struggle, the challenge, but also the tremendous opportunity to bring hope to those who are hopeless. And so I want to kind of do that in just these next few minutes. The first thing that I would mention to you, and I know I'm talking to people who have already heard this, and these are kind of old stats, or the stats are not necessarily old, but the information gets out there. I actually spoke yesterday to a subcommittee, a criminal justice subcommittee for the Attorney General's office at the statewide council on human trafficking, and I spoke yesterday morning to them and kind of started at this known point, because oftentimes when we talk about human trafficking is now this very broad term that covers, umbrella-wise, covers many forms of human trafficking. In fact, the Polaris Project, which is a great place to go for information on human trafficking, they are the organization responsible for the National Human Trafficking Hotline that we all call to when we see or suspect a report. That number being, and I'll just put it out there, that number is 888-3737-888. That's the National Human Trafficking Hotline. It's a number that we encourage people to call if you suspect a human trafficking case, and that will activate the local task force. Wherever you're at, it will get to that, or supposed to, get to that local task force so that they can start investigating that complaint. So that's run by Polaris Project. And if you want to go to their website, that's polarisproject.org. Great organization. I work with them all the time. They kind of capture the data of where human trafficking is going on, kind of tracking it even globally, not just in the United States, but they track it on a global scale. So when the Polaris Project talks about human trafficking now from a global perspective, they will share with you, and you can see it on their website, there's a global flat world map that will talk about who is supplying victims of human trafficking and who's consuming. What countries are known as consumers and what countries are known as sellers or suppliers of human beings. Now we're talking about human beings. And when you look at that map, some of the dark red, which are supply countries, some of the dark red countries are like the old Soviet Union. Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Belarus, China, another one, Thailand, another one. There's some yellows, which are less supply, but still supplying net supply to the market. A lot of African countries would fall into that. Some of the Middle East countries would fall into that. And then there are the shades of blue. And blue represents consuming countries. These are the countries that are consuming these global victims. The darkest blue that you will see on that map when you go to Polaris Project, the darkest blue country is the United States of America. We are the home of the free. You know, we are a country who was founded on, from our earliest days, founded on the fabric of freedom for all and liberty for all, and yet we consume human beings at a higher rate than any other country in the world. We are a top-tier consuming country. That, frankly, friends, that angers me. In fact, this red American male, blood boils when I see that on a map and realize that we who have had our own struggles with slavery are now in the midst of this modern day slavery epidemic called human trafficking. It's a global span. Every country struggles with human trafficking, whether it's supply or demand. We are in a global warfare. And because the footprint is so big, and just to kind of give you the numbers of victims that some reputable organizations will tell you is out there, and I'll give them to you. The United Nations has the number at 27 million. Now that's worldwide, 27 million. Other organizations that are advocacy organizations that I believe their numbers are probably more accurate than the United Nations, they have the numbers up at 50 or 60 million. That's a lot of people in slavery, a lot of broken people, 50 or 60 million. The number that I typically use, because it's a very credible number, comes from the International Labor Organization, the ILO. And the International Labor Organization used to have that number at 20.9 million. That's a lot of people, 20.9 million, which means there's more people in slavery today than at any other time in the history of the world. Right now, today, more people in slavery. 20.9 million. We use that number because it was kind of the lowest number out there, credible organization, and nobody disputed that there were less numbers than that. It was kind of that credible baseline number, 20.9 million. Last year, they revised that number. And I was anxious to see the new numbers that would come out. And being somebody who kicks in doors and rescues people and throws dirt bags and, misguided people into jail and, works very much so day in and day out in this space, I was hoping to see those numbers begin to come down, because I knew that not only myself, but many of my brothers and sisters in blue, but also groups like yours, are working tirelessly to try to make an impact in this space. So my thought was, maybe we'll start seeing those numbers. When the number was released and I saw the numbers for the first time, I was actually stunned, because the number is now 40.3 million. Instead of coming down, it almost doubled. And I was stunned by seeing those numbers, because it actually resonates, and I think it resonates with all of us, that this fight against darkness is not an easy fight, and that darkness hopes to prevail, and yet I believe that we together know that good will overcome evil and light will overcome darkness. I have to believe that. Not only do I just believe that, I know that it does, because I have seen it too many times. What hope will do to the hopeless, I have seen too many times what that will do to somebody. 40.3 million. And what really boggles my mind with that global number is that if you consider that this country that we're sitting in right now, that I love with everything in me, that this country is a consumer at a higher rate than any other country, and then you look at the heat maps of the United States on that same website that I hope you go to and take a look at, you see the heat map and it shows where those red hot spots are in the United States. And then if you drill down and realize that all the seaboards are covered in red, that several of the states have red spots just glowing in them where red hot numbers of sex trafficking is happening. You also drill down to the Tampa Bay area, which is where we're sitting at, and this entire area is covered in bright red. Recognizing that this area is one of the hot spots, not just in the state, but in the nation, for human trafficking activity and reports of human trafficking to the hotline. If you look at that standard for Polaris Project, now this is numbers of reports called in to the hotline. California is number 1, Texas is number 2, and Florida ranks number 3. In that state, Miami-Dade ranks number 1 within the state. Now Orlando ranks number 2, and Tampa Bay ranks number 3. That just happened over the last 18 months or so, because we used to be number 2 in the state. Red hot, red hot. I personally, just from my experience, consider Orlando and Tampa to really be the same because of the I-4 corridor. And we know that it's a red hot transportation hub for victims, especially minors, of sex trafficking, being transported back and forth between those two cities. So we have this issue. We have this big problem that's going on. The reason why I mentioned Polaris Project to you very quickly, because that's not really what I came to talk to you about today, but just to kind of lay foundation. The reason why I mentioned that to you is because Polaris Project now identifies over 20 forms of human trafficking, over 20 forms. But for law enforcement, for me, we recognize 3 that we go after. And these 3 are rather defined. And I'm going to tell you what those 3 are. The first one that we go after, which are not a lot of numbers, there's not a lot of, relatively speaking, not a lot of numbers or people involved in this, is involuntary servitude. So involuntary servitude is going to be the house servant, the house slave. It's going to be the one who does all the domestic chores. Typically a foreign national that's smuggled into the country, and then that's where they find their work as an au pair, a nanny, a house slave. That's the involuntary servitude. The second form is forced labor. Forced labor is going to be things like agriculture. It's going to be construction trades. Landscaping is really big. And these typically are foreign nationals as well that are smuggled into the country, come in illegally, and then they are put into the orange groves and strawberry fields and the sugar cane down in the Miami area. That's where they will find most of the forced labor, sweatshops, things of that nature. The one that gets kind of the biggest media attention is the commercial sex trade. So that's the third form that we investigate. When you look at those numbers, and we talked about the 40.3, and just to lay a foundation, that 40.3 million victims globally is producing $150 billion a year in profits. So human trafficking produces $150 billion a year. Billion dollars a year. Sex trafficking is not the largest numbers. That's forced labor. Forced labor by far has the most people involved as victims. Commercial sex does not have near the numbers as far as victims, but they produce the largest number of dollars of any of the forms of human trafficking. So you got $150 billion, and it's estimated that sex trafficking, even though it doesn't have the largest number of victims, is generating $98 billion a year out of that 150. So you can see that even though less victims, that's where the money really is. That's important for us to understand, is what drives this market is simply the dollars. It's greed, it's money. It's, for the buyer, it may be satisfaction, but for the trafficker, it's all about the money. And that's why the victim, no matter how they're treated, poorly or in some cases treated well with gifts and acts of kindness and things of that nature to kind of lure them in on one end of the scale, that the bottom line is they're nothing but a product. That person has lost their created identity to be who they've been created to be, with now nothing more than a for sale sign stuck to their forehead and a dollar tag looped around their ear. $98 billion a year in the sex trade. So now we have to ask ourselves the question, if this sex trafficking, and you could even go broadly with human trafficking, but I want to really drill into the area I came to talk to you about now. In this sex trafficking, we have to recognize that there is, in law enforcement, we have these kind of visual aids that help us visualize what I'm talking, and we use a triangle. And the triangle, we use it in crime prevention, and we also use it in different crimes that are committed, especially organized crime, which sex trafficking is, RICOs and all those kind of things. And we use this pyramid, and this pyramid has three sides to it, and we are able to visualize that in order for sex trafficking to happen, there are three sides of the crime, three sides of the triangle that have to be in place in order for the crime to be completed. Does that make sense? So those three sides for all of us today in sex trafficking is, you first of all got to have a trafficker. That's one side of the triangle. So there has to be a trafficker. Now, somebody says, well, I've run across a girl that didn't have a pimp. Well, I'll get to that in just a moment, because really she did. And we'll talk about who that pimp was. So you have to have a trafficker. You also have to have a victim, a product from the supply side. And I know that sounds coarse and I don't mean it, but from that, and you also have to have a buyer. Those three pieces have to be in place for that sex trafficking crime to occur and to have the profitability in order for it to continue. Because if you drop any of those out of the equation, the crime falls apart. So if I don't have a victim or somebody to sell, the trafficker and the buyer just immediately kind of dissolve. If I don't have a trafficker or somebody to facilitate, that's going to dissolve. You get the point. Now, what I'm going to mention to you now is and really more of a recent mindset from law enforcement, is that the focus for law enforcement will, depending on what agency it is and how far along they are in this culture shift, the focus of law enforcement has to be reducing demand. We have to really target the buyer. Now, that doesn't mean the others, go away. The trafficker is still going to get investigated. We're still going to arrest the trafficker. The trafficker is still going to go to prison. We still need to rescue the victim, right? And she needs, or he needs, in some cases, all the services that we can give them and provide for them. But if we're going to really impact the crime of human trafficking, sex trafficking, we've got to go after the buyer. We've got to bring the demand down. And there's some reasons in my mind why we have not made more of an impact on the buying part. So let's talk about a historical thing, and then I'm going to really rush to the end because I promise you I won't bore you. In 2015, and now understand that human trafficking, the law of human trafficking, what I get to be able to charge somebody with human trafficking comes from a fairly recent law called the TVPA, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and that was passed in 2000. So that's really as far back as I have as law enforcement to go back and charge somebody with human trafficking is 2000. Now, we know that human trafficking was happening before 2000 because I was arresting people before 2000, but I was charged them with sexual battery, lewd lascivious, things of that nature because I didn't have the charge of human trafficking. So that came about in 2000. The problem with it is that even though that law was passed in 2000, we began to make some inroads in rescuing some victims, and we began to make some inroads in starting to arrest some traffickers, and particularly on the federal system. Not so much on the state system, but really in the federal system. It was a little easier to get that done. So what was happening is we looked around and we said, why are we arresting traffickers, but the buyers are either walking or they get arrested and they pay a misdemeanor, a little fine when they get to jail, and they get to walk out, get back in their vehicle, and go home to mama, and go back to work the next day, and nobody knows what they're doing. It doesn't make sense to me, because that's what's driving this whole market, is this appetite, and I'm going to go ahead and say it, this ravenous appetite for illicit sex activity. An addiction, some people would say, but I'm going to call it an appetite because these men, and sometimes women, but mostly predominantly men, have this appetite for illicit sex. And so my question was why? Well, the answer to that is that the courts were saying that there was really nowhere in the TVPA that would loop the buyer into a human trafficking charge. Even though the word, and I'm going to give you, I know it's technical, but the word obtains is in the TVPA language and should say if you're going to obtain illegal sex, to me that identifies the buyer. But they say, no, that could be that the trafficker is obtaining a victim. And so there was a lot of confusion. So in 2015, John Cornyn, the senator out of the state of Texas, passes a law called the Justice for Victims of Trafficking. That was in 2015. In that, the senator's purpose was to make sure that the courts and that law enforcement understood that the intent of Congress was to make sure that the buyer was held as equally culpable as the trafficker for the harm that's being done by sex trafficking. It said, wait a minute, we know the trafficker is causing harm, but the intent or the sense of Congress in this law was to say, not only is the trafficker causing harm, but the buyer is inflicting enormous harm on these victims and should be held as culpable as the trafficker. And what they did is they added 2 words to Section 108, if you have any interest in technical things. But in Section 108, they added 2 words, and the word was solicits and patronizes. And in that, the senator said there should be no confusion now. Because if you solicit or you patronize, in other words, go into a place and patronize a business for that sexual activity, you are held as equally culpable as the trafficker. Now, what does that really mean? What that means to me, and I'm just a dumb street cop, and I'm not a lawyer, but what that means to me, from my view, is that if a trafficker is going to get 10 years for trafficking, what do you think would happen if the buyer was brought in and given 10 years? Or if it's a minor, state of Florida, that's a life felony, so you can go all the way up to life. What would happen if a buyer knew, you know what, if I go in that club and that dancer looks a little young, but if I have sex with her for $50 or $100 or $150, whatever the price is in the VIP that they negotiate, I could do life. We might have an impact. There just might be an impact in this. So one of the responsibilities that we have is to start putting the pressure, and I testified about this in front of the committee yesterday. And my response to them as policymakers and law enforcement and sitting on this council was, why don't we begin to look at this as a culpability issue and see if we can't start driving down some of the demand? Because I'm going to say it, and I get sued every time I say this, so there'll probably be another lawsuit, especially when they start looking at the film. But the bottom line is simply this: I am sick of the buyer being able to hide behind the mask of anonymity. We even call them a John so that we disguise who they really are. It's time to strip that mask off and say, now you're going to be held accountable for what you've done and the harm that you're doing, and there's no excuse for buying sex. No excuse. So the study comes out, and I want to share this information with you, and I'm going to do it in a quick way. But the study comes out, and this study is probably the largest, well, not probably, it is the largest study on why men buy sex. Interesting study. It was completed in January of 2017, so that's how recent it is. It studied the sex buying habits of over 8,000 men. Exactly 8,102 men. But over 8,000 men, sex buying habits. And from there, they produced 16 major findings. And I'm not going to go through all 16, but just to kind of share with you a few, in particular one that I want to highlight. But in that, they found out that there were, and you'll see on the screen some reasons. These are actually specific reasons that come from the study. But let me share with you, before we get into those, let me share with you the 16 major finders, or at least 5 of those. The first thing they found was something called a high-frequency buyer. So what is a high-frequency buyer? A high-frequency buyer is an active buyer, somebody that buys all the time. Now, they identify it as somebody who buys at least once a month, but in most cases, they were buying at least once a week. So these are high-frequency, what we would call in law enforcement, PSB, a prolific sex buyer. So these prolific sex buyers are buying at a very frequent rate, at about once a week. But the interesting thing is that while they are making up a minority of the sex buyers, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, but they're pumping in 75% of the money into the illegal market. So this group of high-frequency buyers are responsible for 75% of the money that's being pumped into this illegal market. What would that tell me from a law enforcement perspective, or from, if I start targeting them, if I can find out who the high frequency are and go after them, I can make a very big impact by going after a very small group of individuals. Does that make sense? So they are disproportionately pumping money into the market. So let's talk about how many men buy sex. Well, according to this study, most men never do it. Now that, I was relieved when I read that, being a man. I was like, well, thank you. At least we got, it's not all of us doing it, because I know at least one that's not. And I can't speak for everybody else, but I knew of one that was not buying. And but from the study, 20.6% of American adult men have purchased sex. 20.6. That's a big number. I have to confess, it was smaller than I thought it would be, but that's a big number. Of that 20.6%, 6.2% is that high frequency buyer. So you have 6.2% of American men who are buying sex at least once a month, and in most cases, at least once a week. And before we kind of wipe our brow and say, whew, 6.2, that's not, when you look at the population, that means over 7 million men are buying sex at least once a week. The average transaction is a little over $100. Just those numbers equate to $5.6 billion a year. And the thing that bothered me, all of it bothered me, but the thing that probably was enlightening to me, which when I said this at the committee meeting yesterday, caused a lot of very awkward silences, is that the prolific buyer, typically, the typical prolific buyer is making over $100,000 a year. What does that mean to me? It means they probably are men with means and influence. And maybe that's why we're having a hard time getting serious about going after buyers. Just saying. Just saying. So, kind of understanding a little bit about the high frequency buyers, why men buy sex. These were kind of some individual reasons that were expressed of why men buy sex. To engage in sex acts that few other women are willing to engage in. In other words, if I buy you, you just have to do what I want you to do. I can tell you that in some of the brothels that I personally have been in and taken down, and you start doing the interview process, some of the women, what they described that they were required to do, it's sickening, to be honest with you. If a man and a woman are married and they're doing consensual, that's their bedroom. But for a man to be able to come in and demand that, I paid my $25, so therefore you will do this to me, is disgusting. And by the way, just to kind of throw something in here in my closing moments, if I had to identify two things that I have discovered in every single sex trafficking case I've worked in, I have been involved in dozens. If I had to identify two things that are involved in every single one of them, the first thing would be drugs. Drugs are involved in all of them. I had somebody tell me that they had a case where they didn't find drug activity involved in it. I would say that's very rare because I've never seen it. Drugs for several reasons. Compliance would be one of them. An escape would be another reason. It's a high, it's a way to get away. I'm going to go someplace else. I can kind of lose the sensations of what's happening to my body. Those things come into play. And then, of course, the addictions begin to come into play as well. But the other thing is pornography. Every single case I've ever worked, pornography has been there. And when you ask the question, why the pornography? Because you're already going in to do a pornographic act. Why would you need pornography? Well, the answer to that is it's the teaching tools. They will show some of the most violent pornography to the girls and the boys, because never forget, boys are involved in this as too, and they're victims as well. While predominantly girls, boys are involved, but they will teach these kids that when the buyer wants something, here's the way you do it. And this is the way you're going to do things. And some of the pornography we have uncovered is not, and in my view, none of it's good. But just to put that in perspective, this is not the pornography of the 60s, where a centerfold fell out of a magazine and it was a full picture of a naked woman. That's not what the pornography is today. The pornography today is violent, rape, very common in those. It's just violent, snuff films, on and on and on. You can start looking very violent. So what the sex buyer is saying is that we want things in sex that I would never ask of my girlfriend or my wife, and so therefore I can go on the street and I can just buy it, and if I buy it, they have to do it. So that was one of the reasons. to experience sex with women of different physical traits. And you can go right on. They desire to be in control. They want to dominate women. Some say women don't find me attractive and I don't have, but you know what? One of the number one reasons that we found was because they didn't want to be in a relationship. They wanted sex without responsibility. One of the most dangerous attributes a human being can have. Because if you start getting pleasure without responsibility, it leads to a whole lot of things. So next slide, please. So that was some of the reasons why. I also want to mention this to you, and I'm going to be very quick, but this is the stratification of the commercial sex industry. Just so they have a stratification or a high class, middle class, low class, and they very much so hold to this. Oftentimes, if a woman is involved in it in many years, they oftentimes will kind of go through these stratifications in their own experience. But street prostitutions make the least money. It's the most dangerous of the ones that's out there. They make the least money, more likely to be drug addicted, subjected to violence, otherwise distressed. These are pimps who have the least control over their workload. They're actually put out on a street track and told, most of the time, a dollar figure. You have to bring me this much money back. One of the pimps that I had the opportunity to kind of work with, or case that, and I was kind of more on the outside of this case, but it was a pimp who was working his stable through one of the strip clubs in Hillsborough. They lived in Pinellas, was housed in Pinellas, would drive them across, and they worked the girls over in Hillsborough through one of the strip clubs. He would actually tell them when they went out of the house, 400 from you, I want 600 from you, and oh, you were a little lazy last night, so $1,100 from you. And when they came back to the residence, they had to produce that money, and if they didn't, they were beaten. Actually, he would roll them up in a piece of carpet and beat them with a ball bat because he didn't want to bruise the merchandise. And then he would take them and throw them out on a street track, usually on Nebraska, if you're familiar with Tampa, throw them out on Nebraska on a street track until they made that money. A lot of times they'll make them pill sick or dope sick, withhold pills and dope until they actually produce the money, and so that they're very sick when they're working out on the street in many cases until they produce that money. So that's kind of the least, or what is kind of the lower stratification of the sex industry. Then you have the kind of that middle class, which is brothels, massage parlors, and clubs. And if you've been in the clubs, most of you have, and you work in that area, you know how disgusting that is. But that's kind of, so you can only imagine what the street track is. So you have the clubs. And then operating at the highest levels are your high-end elite escort services. Most of these refuse to admit that they're victims because they believe that they are absolutely, it's a choice that they're making, that that's what they choose to do. And in many cases, they don't have the traditional pimp, although they traditionally have what is known as a manager or a business administrator. And so they have higher terms for them, but it's the same structure. Next, please. This, I want to show you that, and I'm only going to point out one of these, and you can read all this if you want to, because I know my time is over. This study here was one that I really wanted to highlight for you, and I'm going to show you why in just a minute. This was a U.S. study, the largest ever done of prostitution. And it followed 2,000 prostituted persons over 30 years. Now, that's a large-scale study, and so there's a lot of interesting things that came out of that study. And it found this, that the mortality rate of a prostituted person was 200 times greater than the same demographic outside that life. So you tell me it's a victimless crime. You tell me there's no harm in this. You tell me damage isn't being done when this group is 200 times more likely to die than anyone else in there. Here's the causes of death, and look at this. The number one was homicide, then suicide, drug and alcohol related problems, HIV, and then accidents was way down the list. And it flips when you come to the other demographics, because the other demographics are accidents are number one. So you can see the danger that is done in this group. The homicide rate among women actively engaged in prostitution was 17 times greater than the rate of age-matched females on any of those ages. Victimless crime? Choose to do this? When you're a little girl, you wanted to wake up and be involved in a life that was going to have these numbers attached? I don't think so. Next, please. Again, you can see some of the health problems that the study found. 80% of samples of women and girls serving as prostitutes had been coerced or forced to engage. At 80% admitted to that. And probably that number was a little higher than that. Next, please. And next. And this is the thing that I thought was interesting, is I get this all the time when I go and talk about this issue. I hear this, well, we just need to legalize prostitution and all these problems will go away. I was in front of the Florida Senate. In fact, I had to cancel on Monica because I got called to the Florida Senate to testify on a human trafficking bill that they're considering. Of what just blew my mind is that when I'm testifying in front of the Florida Senate, here are all these senators sitting up on this dais, and they asked me to come up and talk about this. The one who opposed it, because one of the things we're asking for in this bill was a John registry. So from now on, if you buy sex, you don't get to go home and nobody knows about it. We want to put your name on a registry so that everybody knows who you are and what you did. Seemed logical to me. Boy, there was opposition to that bill. So the group that organized, and they organized, was a group called SWOP. So SWOP, S-W-O-P, stands for Sex Workers Outreach Project. And this is supposed to be a labor union for prostitutes. And so they came, 8 of them came and walked up to the stadium and said, I am a consensual sex worker, or that's the kind word for prostitute, and I am opposing this bill. And they're opposing it because we are taking away their customers. And it was interesting to me that another group that stood up in opposition, and I'll probably get in trouble for this too, was the president of the Florida chapter of NOW, the National Organization of Women. And I thought to myself, are you serious? You will oppose a bill that is intended to protect women, and you will stand in front of the Florida Senate and oppose that. Opposition is strong when you start talking about this kind of money. But again, my thing is, if you're going to buy it and you get caught, everybody needs to know you're a buyer. This was said by a survivor. When I was in the backseat of your car and you were on top of me, when I was giving you oral sex, I couldn't use my own voice to tell you what I really felt. But when you touched me, my skin crawled. I hated it. I hated it. I was scared. I was in pain. I felt violated. I didn't care about you. I just wanted one more hit of crack, so I didn't have to feel like I felt when I was 12 years old. This isn't a victimless crime. I haven't turned a trick in 15 years, and I'm still healing. We've taken a really strong stand in Pasco for some of these vulnerable areas where sex trafficking happens. Whether that's a street track, XXX video store, erotic services, strip clubs. One of the things that we have done is we have required the strip clubs, and it's been a while since we've been in there to do this because of various political reasons. But we required them to put a sign in their bathroom and in their dressing room in all the stalls, that plain language sign that was developed with us or for us by a survivor of sex trafficking out of the clubs of Pinellas and Pasco. And she helped us put a sign together that she felt like would really reach maybe to someone else that was just like her, that may be on a pole, but really needed help. And so we required them to put those signs in their bathroom stalls, and because that may be the only place that they're out of view of their trafficker. They have to put the Attorney General sign in the lobby, but these plain language signs in the dressing rooms. And we go in from time to time and we do what we call compliance checks. And we go in to make sure they're in compliance. And the sheriff's office and code enforcement are the two enforcement agents in our county to make sure that they're doing this. Well, what that does for me in law enforcement is allows me to walk all the way through the club. Because normally, unless I have a complaint, that's private property. So normally, people think law enforcement can do anything we want to. And besides speeding, we can't do everything we want to. Um, so we have to have a reason to go in. There has to be some reason for. We can't just barge into anybody's business and say, I'm gonna go look at your back door or your back room. But this allows me, because I can go check for the signs, and usually the dressing room and the bathrooms are kind of in the back, and so I'm able to walk past the front and get through the dance floor and on to the back and into these kind of private areas. So we did these compliance checks. The lawyer that sued me called it a raid, but it wasn't a raid, it was a compliance check. Although I appreciated that strong word. It was a nice strong word. You raided us. So I kind of liked it. I took it as, yeah, cool. And when my lawyers got done with it, it was a compliance. That sounds too soft. So I kind of liked the other one. No, we raided. So we went in, and so we would go into these. So my thought was that no matter how much we were doing and how often we were doing, when you tell the story, or when you try to tell, particularly policymakers, when you try to tell them, this is what we see, and we want you to know about this, because you need to do something to change this environment, and we need help from a legislative point of view, and not just from those of us who are working this every day. We need help from people who make the rules, who write the rules, to help us stop this. So we invited 2 state senators, 2 state representatives, and 2 county commissioners to go with us on on a compliance check. And we went in. And if I said the name of the particular club, some of you who work the Pasco area would know immediately what club this was. So we went into it, and we chose a couple of clubs, and we went in. Now this, granted, was in the middle of the afternoon, right? Because I've got politicians with me, and they don't work at night. So I'm just kidding. These were great. These politicians happen to be really good people, and they're really good friends of mine. And but they went with me, and so we had our star units go in and kind of secure the facility, and then we went in, and I wanted them to see for yourself. It's one thing to drive down 19 and look over there to this big lighted place where it's offering free tacos on Tuesday, and all this kind of stuff, and girls dancing, and it sounds so fun, and a lot of good going on in here, and what a festive act. But what do you see when you actually get in there? So I wanted them to see what we saw. Instead of me telling you, you come with me. And so they did. And so we walked in. One of the senators that walked in with me was Senator Lauren Book. Senator Book is, in my opinion, is just an amazing lady. And we've grown to be really good friends. She, and it's hard to impress me after all the stuff I've seen. I don't get impressed easy. She impressed me. And I have to tell you that I cannot tell you how much I appreciate it. In fact, she's one of them that is sponsoring the bill that I've been going up because of what she saw in this. And that's Senate Bill 540, in case you're interested in it. And it's working its way through the Senate right now. So Senate Bill 540 is sponsored by Lauren Book. Senator Book went with me into this, and I say that only to kind of reference what I'm about to tell you. So we go into this club in the middle of the afternoon, and it's packed. And I was kind of surprised, because middle of the afternoon, most of the time, and a couple of exceptions, but most of the time it's a little dead in there in the afternoon, and usually older men, maybe in there just in the afternoons, retired or whatever. And so it's smaller crowds. But this place had several dancers in it, pretty big crowd in there, and I was pretty surprised. So we walk into there, and when we walked into the VIP area, and there was the act of prostitution happening right there in this VIP room. Middle of the afternoon, senators are with me, representatives are with me, county commissioners are with me, and we walk in, and it's happening right there. Walk into the dressing room, and there's a young lady there whose head snaps up off the table when we walk in, and her eyes are glassy. She's got the powder on the side of her, right underneath her nose, and kind of running down into the corner of her mouth. Little pieces of grains of cocaine fall down off of her chin. She snaps her head up. She just snorted a line, and there was another line waiting for her to snort. And she just ripped off one, and now her eyes are glassed over, and she's catching the hit of that cocaine as it pounds through her head, and she's catching that, and we're right there as we walk in. I will never forget looking at, here stands the girl and the guy who had just been in the act of prostitution. And I'm not saying that as a judgment call. It was admitted. Money had changed hands. It was a paid for act of sex, an act of prostitution. They asked me, and Monica referenced the story earlier, but they asked me, well, what are we going to do with the guy? And I said, I want him arrested, and I want you to march him around a few times, and we want to make this an example. We're not tolerating this. I want the buyers to know that Pasco will not tolerate this. We find you, you go to jail. Period. So they did. She looked at me and she said, sir, now I want you to catch a picture of this. She has the little outfit on. She's got the big heels on. Makeup. Her eyes are starting to water up from both the hit of cocaine. She's as high as they come. She has a really bad cold. Her nose is running down into her mouth. Makeup is running down her cheek, and you see the black streaks down her cheek. She looks at me and she says, I'm going to jail, aren't I? And before I could even answer that, and Senator Book is standing right here beside me. And I look at her, and of course, Senator's, her eyes are real big, and you can tell, I mean, her heart is impacted. And she said, before I go to jail, can I show you something? I said, sure. She takes out her phone, and on the wallpaper of her phone, when she turns it over so I can see it, are two little kids. And they look like they're probably 3 and maybe 4. And she said, these are my babies. This is why I'm doing this, is because I'm trying to get my driver's license back. And she has this story. I'm trying to get my driver's license back so I can get them to the doctor. And I need the money really bad. And I'm so sorry. And then she made a statement to me that I will never forget. She said, look, I know I'm going to jail, but please don't tell them what I do. My heart broke. Because I thought to myself, yeah, you really want to do this, don't you? Because you don't want your kids to even know. The impressive thing to me is I saw Senator Book put her arms around this girl. And this girl hugged Senator Book. And here's a senator and a prostitute. Weeping, crying. And I thought to myself, if we just knew how to reach out to the broken. No, I didn't arrest her. I wanted her to get help. I looked at her, and on the inside of her thigh, right here, was a handprint. Big, blue handprint. I called her by her stage name. And I said, who did that? Oh, I was dancing a while ago, and one of the customers, like it was just casual, one of the customers came up and reared back and slapped me as hard as he could right here and told me, I'm going to get a piece of that in a minute. Just a piece of property, just a broken piece of flesh. I was really glad that the lights were dim in that place, because here's this big cop with all these years, bulletproof vest and all kinds of gear and equipment on, and I'm crying. My heart's broke. Because I realized that this is really what hope came for. Didn't come to the well, didn't come to the hole. Really came for for Amber. Ugly, messed up, snot running out of her nose, weeping, pictures of 2 kids on her phone. She looked at me and she said, what else am I going to do? I've got 35 charges. I can't even go to college. I can't do this. And all the hopelessness. Reminded me of a statement that I used to hear quite often, and that statement simply said this, that a man can live 40 days without food. He can survive 3 days without water. He can survive 8 minutes without oxygen. But he survives 30 seconds without hope. What I'm looking at here today is hope dealers. Came to seek and save that which was lost. I salute you today. Let's do this. Let's rescue the broken, heal the hearts of the wounded, and bring hope to the hopeless. You may be the only light that they see today.